Chapter 22, Walking Nightmare. Jen surfaced as she turned back into herself, spitting water. She shook her head, droplets flying as she did, grabbing hold of the ladder situated so she could climb back up onto the platform. She was wondering exactly how she'd gotten herself into this. Natalie Alvarez, the woman who'd organized the festival, had met her and Rook at the entrance when they'd arrived. Jen's name had been added last minute to the flyers, way at the bottom, in such small print she barely spotted it herself. Apparently, Miss Alvarez had wanted Kangaroo Commando. It was likely that she meant Abel North, though he hadn't donned the costume in years. His twin brother Kane was still in jail from when he'd framed his brother for several crimes that Jen had managed to stop. But the kids had insisted that they wanted Gen 10. Jen couldn't help but wonder if maybe Miss Alvarez was a bit resentful that her idea had been shot down as she mounted the platform atop the dunk tank. There was a small line of kids and teens waiting to dunk her. She'd already been at this for a few hours. Luckily, the next one asked for Ripjaws, which gave Jen the opportunity to take a deep breath under the water and show off a few flips to blow off some steam. She resurfaced again and turned back into herself, climbing the ladder again. That was about when Rook showed up. He was walking along with JT, who was in a polo shirt that matched the others working at the booths. Jen shook her head as they waved. She was busy dealing with another kid demanding aliens. One kid had about 6 tickets and demanded Spider Monkey, Forearms, and Humongosaur in quick succession. Humongosaur's dunking was anticlimactic as she easily touched the bottom of the tank. "Whatever, you're probably just some lady in a costume." Jen rolled her eyes, barely holding back from pointing out that everyone in the area had literally just seen her transform. She turned back and swam to the ladder again. She sat on the platform getting ready to stand when a roar shook the scaffolding the tank rested on. She had never been happier to see Kyber's dog in her entire life. But when it, as a Psycholeopteran, Big Chill's natural predator, chased her past the newly built Billions Tower and caught her in its stare, her world faded away. She was standing in the Bellwood base. She blinked, confused, until someone stepped up to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you well?" Rook asked, smiling. The door opened and Gwen and Kevin walked in. There was a small gold band on both of their hands, a wedding ring. Gwen grinned at her. "You're late for patrol, doofus." Jen smiled. Rook dove to the side, shooting a blast at Kyber, who barely dodged. Kyber laughed.
"You're quick on your feet, Ravana Gander. But will you be quick enough to save her?"
Rook lunged, a snarl building behind his lips. He caught Kyber's blow with the proto-tool and frowned slightly. He wasn't fighting with everything he had, like he had last time they had traded blows. It was almost as if his comm unit blared to life. "Rook, it's a diversion. They're just here to waste our time." Jen's voice was a welcome sound, the news she brought less so. Kyber laughed, stepping away and stowing his blade.
"And like that, we're done. A friendly piece of advice. I would check your truck."
He turned and raced away in the opposite direction of the parking lot. Rook pressed his comm unit. "You seem to be correct, Jen. Kyber has advised we check the proto-truck. I'll meet you there." Jen reached the truck first. The back door was partially open. She slammed it all the way open, and her heart nearly stopped. Inside the truck was a figure she had not seen in years. One she had hoped to never see again. She had last seen him in a field as she plunged her hand, malfunctioning Omnitrix and all, into the black and red sludge that made up its form. The circular red line on the mechamorph's face turned to her, and she stumbled backwards. "Malware." The word was nearly silent as it slipped from her shaking lips. The mechamorph turned from the console, detaching one of its arms from the machinery. The ghastly tear that was its mouth seemed to quirk upwards.
"You've grown, child."
She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet as Malware slid free from the truck.
"You would do well not to cross me again. It did not go well for you last time.
Jen! The call from the entrance of the festival distracted them both. Rook was racing their way, and Malware took full advantage of Jen's distraction, racing away from both of them. Jen remained rooted to the spot. Her legs seemed to have turned to stone, even as her knees turned to jelly. Rook caught up to her and frowned. He'd never seen true terror on her face before. What happened? She shook her head. Most of her was shaking as adrenaline pumped through her veins, quickly chased by anger. He took something. You need to find out what he took. Some form of courage raced after the anger, the need for vengeance for what Malware had done to her, to feedback. I'm going after him. She took off before Rook could ask again what had happened, why she had gone so pale. It took him time to work through the mess left behind in his truck. By the time he had any idea what had happened, Jen rejoined him. She still looked shaken to the core. What happened? Rook asked, hopping down from the truck. Jen shook her head. What did he take? Rook shook his head, steadying her slightly. Hard to tell. Part of the memory core was destroyed. Jen nodded, putting her hand on his and squeezing slightly as if reassuring herself that he was still there. You're lucky he didn't turn your whole truck to dust. Her voice sounded shattered in a way Rook had never heard. Who is he? She shook her head, fiddling with the Omnitrix. Malware. Short story, he's a galvanic mechamorph and a total psychopath. Long story, she shook her head and seemed slightly relieved to be interrupted by the same kid who'd accused her of just being someone in a suit, approaching and apologizing. She nodded slightly as they headed back to the fair. She turned into forearms and replaced the large wooden bell on its plinth. Natalie Alvarez smiled.
Looks like I made the right choice after all.
Jen smiled slightly, but it looked forced as she headed back to the dunk tank. Rook made to follow her, but she waved him off. He didn't go far, though, as the day began to dim. Her friend JT managed to persuade him into playing a few of the games, and he ended up with a pet goldfish and a rather large stuffed animal that looked like a tiger, but white. He wasn't sure if it was real or not, and was trying to figure that out as Jen made her way over to him, raising an eyebrow. When did you start collecting stuffed animals? Rook frowned. I have not. It was a prize for a game. Jen's eyebrows climbed. Nice, that's a top-shelf prize. Rook held it out to her. I find it slightly unsettling. Jen laughed slightly. It's just a toy. He nodded. Regardless, I find it somewhat unsettling. Perhaps you can have some use for it. She took it, shaking her head slightly. Sure. What are you going to name the fish? Rook regarded the small goldfish carefully. I do not know. Jen smiled lightly. We'll have to stop at the pet store and get you a tank for him. Rook nodded as the stalls around them began to close. They dropped by a nearby pet shop on the way back to the base, and Jen helped Rook pick out a small tank that would fit on his desk in his quarters, along with some decoration and fish food. She helped him carry them to his room and set up the filter on the tank. After that, she bowed out, still carrying the white stuffed tiger. When she reached her own quarters, she locked the door behind her and slid down the door, sobbing into the stuffed animal. She was shaking from head to toe. She had no idea how she'd held it together as long as she had. She silenced her tears when a knock came at the door. Jen, are you well? She kept silent. Maybe he would think she went home to her parents. He wasn't one for barging into her rooms without permission. Silence reigned as tears continued down her face. If you need me, I am here. Silence again. It took a while for his footsteps to recede, though. Jen let out another sob. Chapter 23. Back in time. Or not. Jen hid out in her room until Grandpa Max came looking for her the next morning. He used his code to come into the room. She was still sitting on the floor, though she'd migrated to the wall beside the door instead of against it. She looked up at him with bloodshot eyes, and he knelt down in front of her.
What happened?
Malware. The single word had all the blood rushing out of his face.
You're sure?
She gave him a sardonic look over the stuffed tiger in her arms. He frowned.
Sorry, that was a stupid question.
Jen nodded. Max couldn't help but think that she looked just like she had after losing feedback. So young, with the weight of worlds on her shoulders.
Did he...
He wasn't sure how to ask if he had taken another of her transformations. She seemed to understand him, though.
No.
She shook her head, scrubbing at her red, puffy eyes. Took something from Rook's truck, though. Dusted part of the memory core. We don't know what he got exactly. There's a lot of stuff in the memory core. Max nodded.
I'll get Coop to replace it. See if he can't figure out what was taken. He's the best at that kind of stuff.
Jen nodded. Yeah, he is. Her voice was raw, like she'd spent most of the night crying, which was likely true. Max held out a hand to help her up. After a moment, she took it. He pulled her close, and she clung to him. It was a bit awkward, as she still hadn't dropped the large stuffed tiger yet, but he waited for her to let go first. When she finally did, he carefully guided her into the small bedroom off the main room. He sat her down on the edge of the bed.
You need to sleep. Take off your shoes and get some sleep. I'll let Rook know you won't be making patrol today, unless there's a real emergency.
She kicked off her shoes and curled up under the blanket, so there was just her short crop of hair sticking out of the plush green comforter. She was sure she wouldn't sleep, but once ensconced in the plush blanket, exhaustion took over and her world faded into a dreamless haze. Max shook his head at his granddaughter as he stepped out of her room to message Cooper. He stayed in her quarters in case she needed him. He also called Asmith to let him know that the psychotic mechamorph was indeed still alive. He kept his word and let Rook know that Jen wouldn't be showing for patrol. About 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. Max raised an eyebrow and stood stepping over to the door. Rook stood on the other side with his tea tray. Max smiled at him, letting him inside.
She's sleeping. I don't think she got any last night.
Rook nodded, frowning at the door to her room. He poured 2 cups of tea regardless and handed one to Max.
I thought she went home to her parents, or I would have brought her tea sooner.
Max nodded.
She didn't want to ask for help. She sometimes has problems accepting when it's there.
Rook nodded. He knew that about his partner already. When asked if she needed help, she tended to deny it. It had gotten to be that he didn't tend to offer, he just did it. She usually didn't bring it up when that happened. From what he'd seen when Gwen and Kevin had visited, that was how all 3 of them worked best. They didn't need to talk. They barely needed to look at each other to know what the other was doing. A team that worked together with deadly efficiency. If he had seen them in a true battle, a fight like those he knew they had participated in, it would have been terrifying. And he would have been awed. But when they had raced away from Luma, the 3 of them knowing what each other's actions would be before they made them, he'd felt jealous. It was clear that they had been working together for some time. Gwen and Jen more so than Kevin, but he melded well with Gwen. Her grace and speed a good match for his brute strength. But Gwen and Jen had the easy mark of experience to their movements. Even if he hadn't known who they were, he'd have recognized that they had battle experience. He was shaken out of his reverie when the door to Jen's room slid open. Her hair was tousled with sleep, though she didn't seem to have gotten much. She had her communicator in her hand. Yeah, thanks, we're on our way. She blinked as if she'd been expecting the room to be empty, but finished pulling on her shoe regardless. Is that tea? Rook nodded, handing her his cup. He was glad it had cooled down a bit on his way here because she downed it like a shot and nodded. Lovely. We've got Dimension 12 robots downtown. Rook nodded, Max handing him his cup. Rook took a few sips of the untouched tea as Jen pulled on her other shoe. He set the cup down and followed Jen out of the room. She had the same look she'd had after she'd found out from Kyber that Malware might still be alive. He followed a little closer when he saw that look in her eyes. She should have paid more attention. She knew that. She knew better than to underestimate a 10-year-old. She'd been 10 when she'd gotten the Omnitrix. She couldn't count how many people she had beaten at that age simply because she had been underestimated. She knew better than to take Billy Billions for granted. Apparently, they had been classmates, but Jen didn't really remember him. It made sense. She'd been all about soccer and sumo slammers back then, that and hero time as often as possible. He considered her to be something of a nemesis, but truth be told, she genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. But that seemed to just annoy him. So he'd fired the toy-looking gun in his hand at Jen. Rook got caught in the blast, and now here they were, having still beaten the robots, but there was a problem. Jen ran her fingers through her now waist-length hair.
How the hell did I ever put up with this much hair?
She was 11 years old again. Short, with hair for miles, she yanked a hand through it now and swore colorfully as several strands of her hair came free. She was still in her clothes, though they were now too big for her by a few sizes. Rook was luckier. His proto-armor could change size with its wearer. It even made room for his tail. His voice was quite a bit higher than it had been, too.
I have seen a few photos of you at this age, but you are shorter than I expected. At 11.
She glared at him, a thought crossing her mind to yank his tail for that, but he helped her up and they made their way away from the large sticky ball left behind from when she'd transformed back from Ball Weevil. He was shorter, too, since he was now 11 as well. She shook her head, hair falling into her eyes. They made their way to the proto-truck, but neither could reach the pedals. Jen banged her head into the console in front of her, then fought her hair again as it fell in front of her face. Rook sighed.
Hold still,
he practically squeaked. She stilled as he used his hands, small claws on the ends untrimmed. He kept them trimmed when he was older, to untangle her hair and quickly braid it. Though he worked quickly, the braid was intricate, practiced. He nodded, pulled a piece of rope from out of a pouch on his belt, and tied the braid off with it. She blinked.
When did you learn how to braid?
She asked, some of her annoyance ebbing away.
I have several younger sisters. My first sibling was a girl. I learned to help her before we had another sister.
Jen nodded, looking over the braid.
You're really good at it. Thank you.
They left the truck and tried to call for pickup, but no one recognized her voice or his. So they began the long walk to Max's Plumbing.